I got the pen rotation because I filed 3 supply manifests late in the same week. It wasn't sabotage, or laziness, or even rank incompetence. The Brower Station requisition system ran on a relay node that went down every time the outer docking ring pressurized above 80%, which happened every Tuesday and Thursday when the freighter convoy came through. I'd flagged it twice to Lieutenant Harwick, and twice been told to file a maintenance ticket through the standard portal, which was itself hosted on the relay node, which was down every Tuesday and Thursday. I filed the ticket on a Wednesday. Nothing happened. Filed the manifests late. A compliance flag went to Commander Callis's desk, and Commander Callis had never liked me much, since I'd accidentally corrected his fuel load calculation in a full briefing room, decided that Cadet Anya Voss would spend 6 weeks on Beast Pen kitchen rotation, sub-level 3. I was told it was a learning opportunity. I was told that working close to the station's combat asset cohort built character and operational awareness. I was told that the Vekthari pens were an important part of Brower Station's security architecture, and that serving there was not, strictly speaking, a punishment. Cadet Ryath, who brought me my reassignment chit, told me with her eyes that it absolutely was. Sub-level 3 smelled like heated iron and old stone, which was strange because there was no stone in it, only molded alloy panels and recycled air. The Vekthari had been there for 11 months, and whatever a Vekthari carries in its scales leaves an impression on a space. It's not an unpleasant smell once you're used to it. It's the kind of smell that says something large and patient has been breathing in this space for a long time, and that the space has accommodated itself accordingly. I noticed it every time I came down from the upper levels, weeks, and then at some point I stopped noticing it, which Mose later told me was the first sign that the space had decided to keep you. I reported to Senior Handler Mose on my first morning. Mose was a small, precisely organized man of maybe 50, who had spent 14 years working with combat-rated pack animals, and moved through the pen corridor the way water moves through a channel, without friction, without pausing, without making himself interesting to anything that might notice him. He showed me the feeding protocols, the waste management schedule, the emergency withdrawal procedures, and the location of every panic release in the corridor. He did all of this without looking at me, which I initially thought was rudeness, and later understood was professional courtesy. In the pens, you don't make eye contact with anything unless you mean it. He also gave me the protocol card, a single printed sheet that listed the behavioral indicators, the appropriate responses, the things you did not do, and the reasons you did not do them. It was dense and specific, and had the quality of a document written by someone who had once not followed its advice. "Read it tonight," Mose said. "Read it again tomorrow morning. If you have questions, I'm here from 600. He paused, evaluating me in the way of a man who evaluates things quickly and without theater. "Do you have questions now? What do they want?" I said. He was quiet for a moment. "They want what any pack wants: order, clarity, a known hierarchy." He looked down the pen corridor. "The hard part isn't learning to give them those things. The hard part is learning that you don't give them those things. You either have them or you don't, and if you don't, they know before you do." He went back to his maintenance check. I went to read the protocol card. The adult Vekthari were housed in the main den, a vaulted chamber at the far end of sub-level 3 that the engineers had reinforced 3 times since the original build. There were 7 of them, the largest. A pack elder the station records listed as Asset Sevrath stood a full head above the loading frame of the den entrance when it raised its crest. Its scales were the color of deep water at night, and the ridge crest that ran from its skull plate to the base of its neck was the soft, hammered gold of old coinage. When it moved, the armor plates along its shoulders and flanks shifted and resettled with a sound like a deck of very heavy cards being shuffled. It had been on Brower for the full 11 months, and in that time it had accepted proximity from exactly 3 humans. Mose, Dr. Emmeline Sauer of Xenobiology, and a handler named Portil who had since rotated out. I was told about this on my first morning. I was told it carefully. The juveniles were in the isolation corridor. 4 of them, each about the size of a large dog if the dog had been built for efficiency rather than friendliness. Their crest ridges were still growing in, soft gold, shading, toward the deep amber they'd carry as adults, and their scales hadn't fully hardened yet, so they had a quality of something not quite finished, something still deciding what it was going to be. They were technically in isolation training, which meant they received controlled interaction for specific durations and were otherwise left alone to develop pack internal hierarchy. Mose had a very clear protocol about this. He printed it on a second card and handed it to me separately. I read both cards. I understood both cards, kept them in my breast pocket for the rest of the rotation. My job was simple. I prepared the feeding carts, delivered them to the appropriate drops at the appropriate times, collected the empties, logged the consumption figures, reported any anomalies in appetite or behavior. I also swept the service anteroom, maintained the water lines, and ran the weekly equipment checks on the pen sensors. It was not difficult work. It was repetitive, and it smelled like heated iron, and it was mine, so I did it without complaint. On my second morning, I was walking the isolation corridor with an empty cart, heading back to the service anteroom after the morning feed. The corridor was narrow, wide enough for the cart, and about 6 inches on either side, bright lit from overhead panels, with the pen hatches on my left. I was making a mental note that one of the latches on pen 2 needed the same kind, tension, as the relay node, which was to say it needed attention and would not get it through official channels, when I heard a sound behind me.
Not a sound, exactly.
A presence. I stopped and looked back. The juvenile from pen 3, the one the log sheets listed only as J3, the one who had finished its food 20 minutes ago and should have been settling, was standing in the corridor behind me. It had come through the hatch, which I had definitely latched, and it was standing about 4 feet back, watching me with amber eyes the size of my fist, its crest ridge lifted just slightly in the way that Mose had told me meant attention, rather than aggression. I stood very still. J3 stood very still. After about 30 seconds, I turned back around and continued walking. J3 followed me, rushing, not crowding, just walking. 4 feet behind, matching my pace, crest ridge up, eyes forward, as composed as anything I had ever seen. It followed me to the anteroom door, stopped when I stopped, watched me punch in the code, and then stood in the corridor while the door closed between us. I wrote it up in the log. Mose read it, made a sound that was not quite a word, checked the latch, pen 3. The latch was fine. He checked the hatch seal. The hatch seal was within tolerances. He stood in the corridor for a long moment, looking at the pen, and then looked at me and said, in the considered tone of someone who is updating their mental file on a situation, "Did you change your pace when it came out?" "No," I said. I heard it and stopped, and then I kept going. Mose nodded. He went back to his maintenance check. He did not explain what the question meant, and I did not ask, because I sensed the answer was one I would understand better from the observation than from the explanation. On the third morning, J3 was waiting in the corridor when I arrived. On the fourth morning, J2 had joined it. By the end of the first week, all 4 of them walked behind me every time I moved through the isolation corridor, in single file, spaced evenly, maintaining the same distance. J3 always first. It had apparently established this among them through whatever negotiation juveniles conduct between themselves in the long hours. When no one is watching, then J4, then J1, then J2, who was the smallest and the most deliberate of the 4, and always seemed to be thinking carefully about where it placed its feet. I kept filing the log entries. Mose kept reading them with the same expression, which was the expression of a man who has seen many things in 14 years, and is now seeing a new one, and is taking his time deciding what category it belongs in. On the 6th day, he brought Dr. Emmeline Sauer down to observe Dr. Sauer was a tall woman, in her mid-40s, who wore her hair pulled back in the way of someone who had given up fighting it, and who carried a data recorder, the way other people carry a cup of something warm. Always without thinking, as an extension of the hand. She stood in the observation alcove and watched me walk the isolation corridor with 4 juveniles in file behind me, and made no sound at all for a... Then she said very quietly to Mose, "How long has this been happening?" 6 days, Mose said. "Has she done anything to initiate it?" Mose looked at me. I shook my head. I hadn't done anything to initiate it. I'd fed them on schedule, kept the pens clean, not made sudden movements, Not made sustained eye contact, not offered contact or rejected it. I'd walked the corridor every morning because it was my corridor to walk, and they had started walking it with me. She walks first, Dr. Sauer said, still watching. She sets the pace. She doesn't look back. She's just doing her route, I said. I know, Dr. Sauer said. That's what I mean. She came back the next 3 mornings. She recorded everything. She spent the 4th morning, not in the observation alcove but in the anteroom doorway, closer, making small adjustments to her recorder's focal range and writing notations in the margin end field that she held with her thumb so I couldn't read them. She didn't tell me what she was concluding from the observations, which I took to mean she wasn't ready to say, or that what she was ready to say was something that required some additional thinking before she said it to me. On the 9th day, J3 pressed its nose briefly against my hand while I was pulling the feeding tray out of its pen. It was a single contact, maybe 2 seconds, light enough that I almost didn't feel it through my glove. Then it stepped back and waited. I finished pulling the tray. We looked at each other for a moment. Its crest ridge was in the full attention position, level and steady, the soft gold of it catching the overhead light. Then I continued with the morning feed. I wrote it in the log, under anomalies in behavior, where it technically belonged. By the end of the 2nd week, J3 had started sleeping outside my bunk hatch. I know this because on the 14th night I opened the hatch at 0400 for a bathroom run and nearly stepped on it. It lifted its head, registered that it was me, and put its head back down. I stepped over it carefully and went to the bathroom, and came back and stepped over it again, and went to sleep. In the morning it was gone, back in the pen corridor. I don't know how it got out and back in, and by that point, I had decided that the answer was probably something I was better off not investigating too closely. The Garrison noticed. Garrisons notice everything, eventually, because the only things on a station posting with less to do than the personnel are the sensors, and both of them are paying attention constantly. By the end of week 2, I was getting looks in the mess hall. Not hostile looks, mostly curious ones, with a particular flavor of curiosity that I recognized as the kind that happens when someone has heard something they don't quite believe and are studying you to see if it seems plausible. Cadet Ryath caught up with me on the service level one afternoon and asked, the careful casualness of someone who is genuinely trying to sound casual, if it was true that I was walking the Vekthari like dogs. I said I wasn't walking them. They were walking me. She stared at me for a moment. Then she laughed. Short, sharp sound that meant she wasn't sure whether to believe me, and walked away. 2 days later, she found me again, this time without the casual pretext, and asked if she could come down to sub-level 3 to see it. I told her to ask Mose. Mose said no, citing the standard access protocol, and Ryath had the look of someone who had expected that answer and was not particularly disappointed by it, because the trying was the point. I went back to the pens. On the 17th day, I was running the weekly sensor check on the main den approach, the section of corridor that led from the isolation pens toward the larger vaulted chamber where the adult Vekthari were housed. The check required me to walk the full length of the approach, test each panel node, and mark the readings. I did this every week. The adults were behind the den barrier, and the den barrier was rated to withstand impact from something 8 times the size of an adult Vekthari, so the weekly walk was considered a standard non-event. Mose had done it for 11 months without incident. I was halfway down the approach when I became aware that the quality of the air had changed, not in a way I could precisely describe. It was more a sense of attention. You can sometimes feel that a room you thought was empty is not empty. I kept walking. I checked the next panel node. I marked the reading. I kept my eyes on the panel and my movements on the route. At the far end of the approach, through the transparent barrier, I could see the adults, 7 of them, arranged in various postures of rest. Some lying flat, some crouched at, one standing near the water feature at the back. They were all facing me, not in a threatening way, not the way the threat protocols described, with raised crests and wide stances, and the particular forward lean that indicated an animal preparing to move against something. They were just facing me, crest ridges level, eyes steady, the kind of stillness that large things achieve when they are paying very close attention and have decided that stillness is the right language for this moment. Sivrath was at the front. Pack Elder stood about 10 feet back from the barrier, its great armored head level, its ridge crest in the full raised position that I now knew meant something other than threat. It had the amber-slit eyes of all Vekthari, but they were old eyes, patient in a way that the juveniles' eyes weren't yet, the kind of patience that comes from having learned that time is a medium you live in, rather than something that happens to you. It was watching me with the absolute concentration of something that has already made its assessment and is waiting, without urgency, for the subject of the assessment to confirm it. I watched it back. I had been told not to maintain extended eye contact. I had the card in my breast pocket. I held the eye contact anyway, because stepping away from it would have felt like something other than caution, and Sivrath was old enough and patient enough to know the difference between a caution and a retreat. After a while, Sivrath lowered its head slightly, not far, just enough. A small, precise motion, deliberate in the way that large animals are deliberate when they want to make sure the message is received. I marked the last panel reading and went back up the corridor. I wrote it in the log under behavior. I marked it as significant. Then I went to the mess hall and ate my dinner and thought about what a head lowering meant in Vekthari body language. Fiend. When I got back to my bunk, I looked it up in the behavioral index that was included in the certification module pre-reading. I had technically not been assigned, but which was available in the station library system. Found it in the section on interpack communication protocols. I sat with what I found for a while before I went to sleep. Dr. Sauer found me at breakfast the next morning. She sat down across from me without asking, set her recorder on the table, and said,
"Did Mose tell you about last night?"
I said he hadn't. Sivrath moved to the front barrier at approximately 2200 hours, she said. Stayed there until approximately midnight, then returned to its rest position. The behavior logs show it was facing the isolation corridor. Thought about J3 sleeping outside my bunk hatch. About what it would mean if the pack elder and the juvenile were in communication, each in their own way running the same assessment. They talk to each other, I said. In ways we don't fully understand yet. Yes, Dr. Sauer said. She picked up her recorder and looked at it without seeing it. There's a low-frequency resonance register that we can detect in the sensor logs, but can't fully decode. It seems to function as a kind of continuous broadcast state information. Not a conversation exactly, more like a shared awareness of the pack's condition. What one member knows, the others know in some attenuated form. Sivrath knows what the juveniles have decided, I said. Or made its own determination and is cross-referencing, she said. We don't know which direction the information flows in a case like this, but something is being communicated. She looked at me directly. Anya, I want to be precise with you, because I think you deserve precision. What I am watching happen in those pens is something I have read about in field, reports from 3 other installations over the past 8 years, and in 2 of those cases, the Garrison command missed what was happening until the situation was, let's say, complicated. What is it? I said. The Vekthari have a formation behavior, she said. It's not a trained behavior. It's not a conditioned response to feeding. It's a social declaration. The one who walks first, who sets the direction, does not look back for reassurance. In their hierarchy, that individual is the line leader. Pack follows because the line leader has demonstrated, without fanfare, that they know where they're going. I looked at my food. I wasn't trying to lead anything, I said. I was doing my route. I know, Dr. Sauer said. That's precisely what a line leader does. They don't try. They simply go. She let that settle. I've flagged it to command as a potential bonding claim event, she said. Means it's now in Commander Keflis's briefing queue. I want you to know that before he calls you in, because he will call you in, and I want you to understand what the flag says and what it doesn't say. What does it say? It says the Vekthari isolation cohort has exhibited formation-following behavior toward a specific handler, consistent with line leader designation. It says this behavior is documented over 17 days across multiple observation windows. She paused. It says the handler did not initiate or deliberately cultivate the behavior. What doesn't it say? It doesn't say what Callus is going to do with it, she said. I'm sorry, that part is above my access level. She stood up, tucked the recorder under her arm, and looked at me with a careful occult expression of someone who is to say something reassuring but is committed to precision as a professional standard and will not sacrifice the one for the other. Walk your route, she said. Whatever he says, walk your route. She left. I finished my breakfast. Then I went to the pens. All 4 juveniles walked behind me that morning, in file, without variation. J3 first, J4 second, J1 third, J2 last and deliberate. The corridor was narrow, and the overhead lighting was industrial, and the cartwheels needed oiling, and it was nothing. It was just my route. I walked it. In the days between that breakfast and the morning Callis called me in, the Garrison's attention intensified in the way of a place that has gotten hold of a story and is waiting to see how it ends. I heard it in the mess hall, in the service-level corridors, in the break room outside the sub-level 2 equipment bay. Not gossip exactly, more the particular hum of a population that has been given something to think about and is thinking about it in shifts. Moses' name came up. Dr. Sauer's name came up. My name came up, attached to various degrees of skepticism, and something that might have been on the spectrum between skepticism and belief, a cautious preliminary wonder. One of the senior maintenance engineers, a man named Holt who had been on Brower for 6 years, and had the bearings almost, who had seen postings come and go, and was not interested in drama, stopped me in the service corridor one afternoon and asked without preamble if it was true that the pack elder had moved to the front barrier the previous week. I said it was. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, Till, the handler before Mose took over full-time. Till was here for 3 years, and Sevrath never moved to the front barrier, not once. He walked away. I went back to the pens. Commander Orvith Callis called me into his office on the 19th day. The office was on level 1, far from the smell of heated iron, and it looked out through a narrow viewport onto the docking ring. Callis sat behind a desk that was clear except for a single data pad, and he looked at me with the expression of a man who has reviewed a situation and found it disorganized. Cadet Voss, he said, Dr. Sauer has filed a behavioral assessment regarding the Vekthari isolation cohort. Yes, sir. In her assessment, she describes a pattern of formation behavior directed at you specifically. He looked at the data pad. She categorizes this as a, quote, line leader designation event, consistent with Vekthari pack bonding protocol. That's my understanding, sir. Your understanding. He set the pad down. Cadet, you were assigned to feast pen kitchen rotation as an administrative posting. Your function is logistical. Feeding, maintenance, logging. You are not a certified handler. You are not a xenobehavioral specialist. You are not, by any definition in the station's personnel matrix, a designated Vekthari interface agent. No, sir, you have, through a series of actions that Dr. Sauer diplomatically describes as passive and unremarkable, managed to insert yourself into the social hierarchy of a pack of combat-rated alien predators. He paused, without authorization. I thought about explaining that I hadn't inserted myself into anything. J3 had come through a latched pen door on my second morning, and I had simply not run away. But I looked at Callis's face. Isend decided that the accuracy of this account would not meaningfully address what he was concerned about. Callis was not concerned with what had happened. He was concerned with what it meant for his station's organizational structure, and those were 2 different conversations. I didn't intend to, sir, I said instead. Intent is not the relevant variable, he said. The relevant variable is station security and proper asset management. The Vekthari are combat assets, not pets, Doctor. Sauer's flag creates an administrative complication because it implies a behavioral dependency that may affect the cohort's operational readiness, and that dependency centers on an uncertified cadet on a disciplinary rotation. He picked up the data pad again, moving you from beast pen duty. Effective tomorrow morning, you'll be reassigned to cargo inventory on level 2. Mose will resume full isolation corridor protocols. He said it the way he said everything, without particular heat, without satisfaction, as a logistical statement. The perimeter required clarity, the asset required proper management. Cadet Voss was not proper management. Yes, sir, I said. I went back to the pens that afternoon and told Mose. He listened without expression. He was reseating a sensor panel in the isolation corridor wall, and he kept his attention on the panel while I spoke. And when I finished, he said he'd update the protocols. Then he said, without looking up from the panel, "Did he give you a reason?" "Asset management," I said. "I'm not certified." Mose replaced the panel cover. He checked the seal on it twice, which was once more than he usually did. "I've been filing my own behavioral assessments," he said, parallel to Sowers. Through the handler's reporting channel, not the science channel. Callus may not have seen them yet. He put his tools away. He will. He went back to his maintenance check. I walked the isolation corridor one more time that afternoon, alone without the cart. J3 came out of Pen 3 and fell in behind me, then J4, then J1, then J2. I walked the full length of the corridor, then I walked back. I stopped at the anteroom door and stood for a moment with my hand on the panel, looking at the four of them arranged in their file behind me, and I said quietly, to no one in particular, "Walk the line," which was what had come to mind and what seemed, in that moment, be the right thing to say. Then I went through the anteroom door. Behind me, through the door, could hear the soft peach sound of 4 juvenile Vekthari settling back against the pen wall. I slept badly, not from fear or grief, anything dramatic. I slept badly because I kept thinking about the head lowering, about Sevrath at the barrier at midnight, about J3 watching me with its crest up in the way that meant attention, about the thing Dr. Sauer had said, and what it meant that the pack elder already knew, was already filing its own parallel assessment through whatever channel pack elders used, was already waiting at a barrier in the night facing an empty corridor. At 5:30 the next morning I got up, dressed, and went to the pens for the last time to collect my personal gear from the anteroom locker. I had a water bottle, a spare pair of work gloves, and a charging cable I'd left on the shelf 3 weeks ago and not needed. I punched the code, went in, collected the items, and was pulling the locker shut when I heard the door at the far end of the anteroom, the one that opened onto the main den approach, open. I turned around. Mose was standing in the doorway with his maintenance kit. He looked at me. He looked at the corridor behind him. "They're up," he said. "The adults, all 7. He said it in the same voice he used for everything, calibrated and without inflection. "Sevrath's at the den barrier. Has been since approximately 0400. I checked the logs when I came in. I looked at my water bottle and my spare gloves and my charging cable. "I'll wait," I said. "Probably wise," Mose said. He went back through the door. I sat on the bench beside the locker and waited. The anteroom was quiet the way that spaces adjacent to something significant are quiet. Not empty, but held. I could hear, very faintly, through the alloy wall that separated the anteroom from the isolation corridor, the sound of the juveniles moving. Not frantic movement, deliberate movement. The particular quality of creatures that have decided something and are arranging themselves accordingly. Sat on the bench and held my water bottle and my spare gloves, and thought about Mosef filing parallel behavioral assessments through the handler's channel, and about what it meant that he'd known to do that, and about 14 years of working with pack animals, and what a person learned in 14 years about when something was happening that the official structure was not equipped to name. Commander Callus arrived at 074 with 2 officers, Lieutenants Yang and Farrow. They were in duty dress, as if they had come from a scheduled briefing, rather than specifically for this, which was the kind of detail Callus managed carefully. He punched the anteroom code himself, which meant he'd had Mose give it to him, and came through the door with his 2 officers behind him, and looked at me sitting on the bench with my water bottle, and my gloves, and my charging cable. "Cadet Voss," he said. "You're not on duty." "No, sir. I was collecting my gear." "Then you should proceed to your reassignment." "Yes, sir." I stood up. I was just going to say goodbye to the juveniles first. Callus looked at me for a moment with the expression that was his version of reading a situation and finding it administratively unusual. "You have 5 minutes," he said. "Then you report to Level 2. Mose will escort the cohort through the transition protocol." "Yes, sir." He stood aside, and I went through the far door and into the main den approach. I should be precise about what I saw and what I didn't see. I didn't see Callus's expression in the moment that followed, because my back was to him. I saw the approach corridor, which was lit as usual, and the transparent barrier at the far end, and through the barrier I saw the den. All 7 adults were on their feet. They were arranged along the barrier in a line, not the loose grouping of an agitated pack, not the clustered press of animals responding to a threat stimulus, but a line evenly spaced, crests raised in the full attention position, amber slit eyes all oriented toward the corridor. Toward me, Severeth was in the center. I kept walking. When I got to within a few meters of the barrier, I stopped. Severeth and I looked at each other. Pack Elder raised its crest to the full formal height, not the attention position, not the half raise it had used at the barrier before, but the full formal raise that the behavioral index described as the recognition posture, the one used between pack members of acknowledged standing, a greeting between equals. Or more precisely in the Vekthari hierarchy, a greeting offered by a pack elder to a line leader at the opening of the day's pattern. I nodded at it. It lowered its head in the small, precise movement it had used on the 17th day. Behind me, I heard the anteroom door open, and Callus stepped through into the approach corridor. What happened next happened slowly, and quietly, and with the particular completeness of something that doesn't need to hurry because it has already arrived. The barrier between the den and the approach was rated for impact. It was not sealed. It could be opened from either side, via a heavy sliding mechanism on a motorized track, and in non-emergency conditions it required a keyed release from the handler station to prevent accidental opening. In emergency conditions, in cases where the sensor suite flagged a threat response trigger in the den, the barrier would automatically release to allow the pack to respond. The sensor suite had thresholds. The behavioral index described them. I had read the behavioral index. I don't know precisely what value Severeth understood, or how it understood it, or understood is even the right word for what a pack elder does when it has been waiting at a barrier for 4 hours in the pre-dawn dark. The thing it has been waiting for finally resolves into a specific shape. I know what happened. The barrier opened. Severeth came through first. It moved at a walk, which on an adult Vekthari at its size is still a pace that you feel in your chest. The armored plates shifting and resettling, the clawed feet placing themselves with enormous deliberate precision on the corridor panels. It walked past me, not toward me, and positioned itself in the corridor between me and the anteroom door. Behind it, 2 at a time, the rest of the adults came through. They spread into the corridor in the unhurried manner of animals that have all the time in the world and know it, because the relevant decision has already been made, and what remains is simply the expression of it. They did not snarl. They did not advance toward Callus or toward the lieutenants. They simply stood in the approach corridor, arranged in a loose line, crests up, eyes forward, between Commander Callus and me. I should be precise. The line was not aggressive in the way the threat protocols described aggression. Crests were up but level, not forward-angled. The posture was settled, not coiled. No animal was making sound. The air in the corridor had the quality of something deeply decided, not tense exactly, more like the moment after a door is locked, when the action is complete and what follows is simply time. Callus said, very carefully, Mose. Mose appeared in the anteroom doorway, looked at the corridor. He looked at Severeth. He looked at Commander Callus with the expression of a man who has spent 14 years learning to read what he sees and is reading it now very clearly. Sir, he said. Containment protocol, sir. Mose looked at the corridor again. 7 adult Vekthari arranged in a line, crests up, eyes forward, making no sound. Containment protocol requires me to enter the approach corridor. A pause. Do you want me to enter the approach corridor, sir? Another pause. Longer. No, Callus said. I had stepped to the side of the corridor, near the barrier housing, and I stood there with my water bottle, and my gloves, and my charging cable, and I watched Commander Orvith Callus stand at the far end of the approach and look at 7 adult Vekthari, who were not threatening him and were not retreating, and were simply there, in the corridor, between him and whatever he had intended to accomplish. He stood there for a long time. 43 minutes. According to the den approach sensor log that Dr. Sauer pulled afterward, which she shared with me because she believed in precision and thought I deserved to know. 43 minutes, in which Callus did not raise his voice, did not issue any further commands, did not attempt to enter the corridor. He stood at the far end of the approach with his 2 lieutenants and watched 7 adult Vekthari not do anything at all. And at the end of 43 minutes he turned around and went back through the anteroom and up the level 1 stairs. The lieutenants followed. The anteroom door closed. The adults stayed in the approach corridor for another hour. They didn't settle or rest. They simply stood, crests up, until some internal determination passed, and Severith turned and walked back into the den. The others followed in order, unhurried, and the barrier, which had stayed open, because the sensor suite had registered no threat response trigger, and therefore had no automated protocol, resealing on its own, was eventually cycled shut by Mose, who spent a great deal of time very carefully not looking at me while he did it, and who said nothing at all, until the seal indicator went green, at which point he said, without turning around, "I'll update the log." I went through the anteroom and into the isolation corridor. All 4 juveniles came out of their pens and fell in behind me, J3 first, J4, J1, J2, careful and deliberate, thinking about its feet. I walked them to the end of the corridor and back. I didn't have the cart. There was nothing to deliver, and nothing to collect, and no route to run. But I walked it anyway, because it was the corridor, and they were the ones who walked it with me, and when I was done I said very quietly, "Walk the line," was apparently what I said now, and went to find Dr. Sauer. She was in her office on sublevel 2, which was warmer than the pens, and smelled like processed air, and recycled coffee, and faintly, because she had been spending a great deal of time in the pens, like heated iron. She was looking at the morning's sensor logs when I came in. 3 minutes, I said. "Yes," she said. I was going to say 40, but I checked the timestamp. I sat in the chair across from her desk. "Happens now." "The removal order goes into administrative review," she said, "which means it sits on a desk at the station prefect's office until someone with sufficient rank and interest decides to act on it. The station prefect's is Commandant Ruel, who has been briefed on the Vekthar behavioral assessment, and who, I am told by sources I'm not going to identify, found the assessment extremely interesting." She set down her stylus. "My professional expectation is that the removal order will be quietly voided within the week. My professional expectation is also that Commander Callis will request a transfer within the month, but that is somewhat outside the scope of my expertise." I looked at my water bottle. "I didn't do anything," I said. "You walked your route, Doctor," Sauer said. "You fed the animals on schedule. You didn't flinch. You didn't perform. You didn't try to make them like you or demonstrate to them that you were safe. You simply went about your work, calmly, in their space, as if the space was yours to be in." She paused. In their reading of that there was no uncertainty. A thing that is uncertain hesitates. Thing that belongs does not. "I was just trying not to get reassigned to cargo inventory," I said. She almost smiled. "Not quite. I know," she said. "But you weren't, and they knew." The removal order was voided on the 22nd day. I was not told this officially. Received a new rotation assignment that listed my duties as Beast Pen Kitchen Rotation, Sublevel 3, with an amended notation that read assigned handler, isolation cohort, secondary den interface. The annotation came with a code I didn't recognize, and when I asked Mose what it meant, he said it was a provisional certification level, and that Dr. Sauer had filed the paperwork, and that if I started the formal modules in the next 30 days, the provisional hours would count toward the practicum requirement. "You'll need to complete 4 modules," Mose said, in the tone of a man who considers this a formality, but is professionally required to present it as significant. Theory, behavioral assessment, emergency protocol, and interspecies communication framework. The last one's harder than it sounds. "How long did it take you?" I asked. 8 months, he said, but I didn't have the practicum hours. He looked at the isolation corridor. "You have more practicum hours than most certified handlers twice your age." He went back to his maintenance check. Was the end of the conversation. Commander Callis remained on station for another 3 weeks. He avoided sub-level 3, which had always been his practice, and he did not speak to me again, which was a change from the practice of someone who had a use for a compliance flag whenever one appeared. On the morning he departed, I noted it in the way I noted everything that month, as something that had happened and was part of the record. I was running the weekly sensor check on the den approach, And Sevreth watched me from the den through the barrier and lowered its head when I finished the last panel reading. I nodded and went to collect the juveniles. It was Dr. Sauer who eventually told me what walk the line meant in the context she was starting to build her paper around. She had been assembling documentation for 7 months by then, video logs, sensor records, consumption data, behavioral mapping that she'd been refining with the help of a colleague at the Varant Institute, who specialized in pack hierarchy structures among large-scale predatory species. She was precise about language in the way that people who are building something meant to last tend to be. And when she sat me down one afternoon in her office and explained what she'd concluded, it was with the particular care Shams who has checked the conclusion many times and is now confident it will hold. In Vekthari pack structure, the line is not a metaphor. It is a physical thing, a social thing, the fundamental unit of pack identity. The pack forms a line behind the individual who walks first, who holds the pace, who does not look back. This is not a behavior that is trained into them or rewarded out of them. It is a behavior that arises when a Vekthari, juvenile or adult, recognizes something in another creature's movement that matches a specific internal signal. The signal is not about size or strength or demonstrated combat ability. It is about steadiness, directionality, particular quality of motion that says this creature knows where it is going and is not asking permission to go there. They don't follow the most dangerous individual, Dr. Sauer said. They follow the one who doesn't hesitate. She had reviewed the sensor footage from my second morning, from the moment J3 came through its pen hatch and fell in behind me in the isolation. She had reviewed it many times, and she had run it through the movement analysis suite twice to verify what she was seeing. She found was that I had not changed my pace when I heard J3 behind me. I had not slowed down, speeded up, turned, flinched, altered the angle of my trajectory by any measurable degree. I had simply continued walking my route at the pace I had established, and J3 had adjusted its pace to match mine. "That's it," I said. "That's it," she said. "You set the line, you kept it, they joined it." She paused. The adults following Sevreth into the approach corridor. That was Sevreth confirming what the juveniles had already declared. Pack elders don't form behind an individual unless the full cohort has already made the determination. They ratify. They don't initiate. I thought about this for a while. What does it mean for their operational status? I asked. If they've bonded to a specific handler, it means their operational status is exceptional, she said, with the precision of someone who has been waiting to say something and has chosen the moment carefully. Combat-rated Vekthari that have undergone a stable line leader bond perform at 40% higher effectiveness in sustained deployment scenarios. The bond doesn't make them dependent. It gives the pack elder a confirmed point of reference for the line. When the line leader is present, the pack's hierarchy is unambiguous. When the line leader is absent, the pack elder holds the hierarchy in trust and operates against the line leader's last established direction. She looked at her recorder. The 3 other installations I mentioned. The ones where command didn't identify the bonding event early. In 2 of those cases, pack elder eventually refused to operate under any command structure because no sanctioned handler matched the behavioral threshold. It took years to resolve. And the third? The third resolved itself naturally, she said. The individual the cohort had bonded to was eventually given a formal handler certification and a permanent posting. She looked at me steadily. I believe that outcome is sometimes deliberate on the pack's part. I don't have enough data to state it as a finding, but I believe it. She closed her recorder. "You name them," she said. "The juveniles." I hadn't told her that. The names weren't in any official log because they were nothing. Just small sounds I'd started using in the isolation corridor because I felt odd. Not using anything because you talk to things you care for, even when the talking is mostly for your own benefit. J3 was Sev, a diminutive that had arrived without intention on the 4th day, and stuck. J4 was Roll. J1 was Edda. J2, careful, deliberate one who thought about its feet. I called Quiet, which wasn't a name exactly, but was what it was, and I had given up trying to replace it with something else. "Yes," I said. "Do they respond to the names?" I thought about Sev lifting its head in the dark corridor, outside my bunk hatch, registering the sound of me, putting its head back down. About quiet, stopping and sitting whenever. I said its name and waiting with the expression of an animal that is listening to something you haven't said yet. Yes, I said. Dr. Sauer wrote something in her recorder. She didn't tell me what. By the 6th month, I had completed 2 of the 4 formal certification modules, which Mose said was faster than most, and Dr. Sauer said was faster than anyone she had seen come through a practical hours pathway. Didn't say that the modules covered information I had already learned by walking the isolation corridor for 6 months, with 4 juveniles at my back and a pack elder watching through a barrier, and that learning it from a tech system was mostly a matter of translating what I already knew into the official vocabulary. I said thank you and moved on to Module 3. Sev was half again the size it had been when I arrived. All 4 of them were growing fast in the way that Vekthari juveniles do, in bursts, as if the body is making a series of large decisions in quick succession, and then pausing to assess the results. Sev's crest ridge had deepened from soft gold to a full hammered amber, and the scales along its shoulders had hardened into the proper armor plate, structure that adults carried. When it stood behind me in the isolation corridor now, it stood nearly at my shoulder. The sound of its movement had changed too. The plates were settling into the card shuffle sound of the adults, lower and more deliberate than the lighter shifting it had made as a younger juvenile. Raul had started doing something I hadn't seen described in the certification modules, was lying across the doorway of whichever space I was working in, flat on its belly, with its chin on the sill, watching me work, not blocking the door. Its body was large enough that passage required stepping over it, but it was positioned to one side and angled so that the gap was workable, which suggested this was intentional, not demanding anything, just there, watching. I had asked Dr. Sauer about it, and she had said it was a den guardian behavior, a way of declaring a space occupied by the pack, and that Roll had apparently decided the service anteroom and any space I was regularly in constituted den space. It's a compliment, she said. It's also a tripping hazard, I said. Also that, she agreed. Etta had begun collecting locks from objects for the quarter, small pieces of debris, a dropped stylus, a section of broken sensor casing, what appeared to be a fastener off one of the equipment panels, and leaving them near my locker. Not at the locker, near it, in the way of a gift offered at a threshold, placed with care and then left alone. I had asked Dr. Sauer about this too, and she had described it as a threshold offering, a behavior associated with juvenile Vekthari in the process of establishing their contribution to PAC's resource base. It's telling you it can provide, Shai said. It wants you to know. I left the objects where they were. By the 6th month there was a small, precise arrangement on the floor, next to my locker, that I worked around carefully every morning. I had begun to think of it as the collection, which was not its name but was how I related to it. Quiet remained deliberate, thoughtful in the way that suggested something happening beneath the surface that had not yet found its full expression. When I said its name, it stopped and sat and waited in the particular posture of an animal that is listening to something you haven't said yet. In the 4th month, it had begun, once each morning, to walk alongside me for one length of the corridor rather than behind me. Not ahead, jostling for position, just beside, matching my pace exactly, its eyes forward. I wrote it in the log and asked Dr. Sauer what it meant. She was quiet for a longer time than usual before she answered. In some pack structures, she said, there's a role that doesn't have a clean translation. Something between an advisor and a second. Not the one who walks first, that's the line leader, but the one who walks beside. The one whose job is to be parallel, to hold the same line from a different position. She looked at her recorder. I'm going to have to think more about this. Don't want to state it as a finding yet. But you have a sense of it, I said. I have a sense of it, she said. Yes. Sevrath remained at the front of the den on the days I worked the main approach. It lowered its head when I passed. I nodded. The other adults had begun doing the same, and I had stopped noting it as significant in the log because it had become simply what happened the way the corridor, simply the corridor, the way the smell of heated iron had become simply the smell of a place I worked in and knew. In the 3rd month of my formal certification, Dr. Sauer arranged for a structured observation with 3 senior xenobiologists from the variant Institute, who came to Brower Station specifically to spend a week in the pens. They were precise, careful, respectful of the protocols, very quiet during the morning walks. On the last day of their visit, the most senior of them, a woman named Dr. Olave, who had for 40 years in the field and the unhurried quality of someone who has stopped needing to prove things and is now simply watching, stood in the observation alcove and watched me walk the isolation corridor with Sev and Roll and Edda and quiet behind me and quiet at my side for one length. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said to Dr. Sauer, "When did the line alongside behavior start?" Dr. Sauer told her. Dr. Olave looked at the corridor. "In 14 documented line leader bonds across 6 species," she said, "I have seen the second role emergence 3 times. Twice in multi-decade bonds. Once in a bond of 11 years." She looked at me. "You've been here 7 months." I said I knew. She looked back at the corridor. "Walk your route," she said, which I recognized as the same advice Dr. Sauer had given me on the morning before Callis called me in, and which I suspected was not a coincidence. Some advice is so correct that it arrives from multiple directions. I walked my route, Dr. Sauer handed me a piece of paper near the end of the 7th month, which was unusual. She worked in data and recordings and did not deal much in paper. On the paper was the certification code for Module 4, which was the final module, with a notation that the practicum requirement had been formally satisfied. Below that was a second code I didn't recognize, and below that, a note in her handwriting that said, "Commandant Ruel approved the permanent posting this morning. I thought you should see it on paper first." I looked at the paper for a while, then I folded it carefully and put it in my breast pocket, where I had once kept the protocol cards. That evening, after the last log entry, I walked the isolation corridor one more time. Sev came out first, then Roll, then Edda, then Quiet, and Quiet walked beside me for one length, matching my pace, eyes forward. Corridor was the same corridor it had always been, narrow, bright lit, smelling of patience and iron, and they moved through it with me the way they always moved. Not because I asked and not because they had been trained, but because of first week of my rotations, the line had been set, and they had joined it, and that was simply what was. I said at the end of the walk, "Walk the line." They settled back to the pen wall. I went to my bunk. The first morning of my permanent posting, I walked from my quarters through the sub-level 3 corridor toward North Mess Hall service entrance. I walked the way I always walked, at the pace I had set on the second morning of my rotation, not fast, not slow, the pace of someone who knows where they are going and is not asking permission. Sev came out of the isolation corridor and fell in behind me. Then Roll, then Edda. Quiet fell in beside me, matching the pace, and from the main den approach, moving at a walk that you felt in your chest. The deep card shuffle of armored plates, settling and resettling. Sevrath came through the open barrier and joined the line. Behind Sevrath, one at a time, the other adults. The Garrison service corridor was not a narrow corridor. It was wide enough for equipment transport, wide enough for 4 people abreast, and at 061 Fev it had a reasonable population of personnel moving toward various morning duties. We walked it. All of us, the line of us, and the garrison parted. Not because anyone shouted or signaled or gave an order, not because there was any drama or announcement. They simply stepped aside, turned to watch, some of them mid-step, and some of them carrying things, and some of them, FMCMCN, who had been here through the whole 7 months, already oriented toward the corridor in the way of people who have been expecting this moment and are glad to see it arrive. I didn't look back. I never looked back. I got to the mess hall service window and picked up my morning tray. Behind me, the corridor was quiet in the way that corridors are quiet when they have been asked to hold something, and the adults stood at ease, and Quiet sat carefully in its deliberate way, thinking with its amber eyes half closed. Edda's threshold collection would be in the anteroom. Roll would be at the doorway of the service anteroom by 07 Hunter Road. Sevrath would lower its head when I passed the den approach at the start of the weekly sensor check. Sev pressed its nose against my hand. One brief contact, the same as the 9th day in the pen, and then it stepped back and waited. I picked up my tray. "Walk the line," I said quietly, to no one in particular and to all of them. The garrison corridor held its quiet all the way to breakfast.